Right, so in this video we're going to look at cues and some things to think about when you get in a queue for playing snooker. But the first thing I'd just like to say in this video is that you don't need to worry too much about what cue you're using. As long as you've got a nice straight piece of wood with a decent tip on the end, then I always say to people that you'll get better improvements by thinking about your own technique and the way you actually hit the ball than you will by spending a lot of money on a snooker cue. So first of all, let's look at the length of the cue itself. So with most standard cues, they're about 57 or 58 inches long. And as a rough guide, they say that your cue, when you put it flat on the floor like that, it should come roughly up to your shoulder there like mine does. So my cue is actually 57.5 inches long, and I'm about 5'8", maybe 5'9" if I've got my shoes on. So that's roughly the normal length for an average size player. Obviously, if you're a little bit taller, then you might want to get a cue that's a little bit longer than that. So the next thing to think about is the weight of the snooker cue. So some of the old cues were anything from about 16.5 ounces all the way up to about 20 ounces, which is quite heavy for a snooker cue. I would say most players go somewhere in the middle of those ranges there. So my cue is 18.5 ounces. And again, that just really comes down to personal preference. It just comes down to what you like the feel of when you're playing shots. I don't like my cue to be too heavy. I also don't like a cue when I use it and it's a little bit too light. So I settled on a cue that was 18.5 ounces, somewhere in the middle. So in terms of weight, again, it just comes down to personal preference and just exactly what you personally prefer. Now, another thing just to consider with the weight of the cue is just where the balance point is. So cues are actually balanced at a certain point, so my balance point is about there where the cue balance is. And again, this just comes down to personal preference, whether you prefer the weight a little bit more towards the back of the cue or whether you prefer to have a little bit of weight more towards the front of the cue. Again, that's just personal preference and it's just going to come down to exactly what you like the feel of most. Now, the next thing to think about is your ferrule and tip size. Now, most snooker cues are anywhere from 9.5 millimeters to 10 millimeters in diameter. That's what almost all of the professionals would use. And again, it just comes down to personal preference of exactly what you prefer. My tip is actually 9.75 millimeters. So again, as I say, it just comes down to personal preference. Sean Murphy actually uses a tip that is 8.75 millimeters. I think he said that in the past when I saw him interviewed about talking about his cue. That's unusual though. Almost all of the professional players will be somewhere from 9.5 to 10 millimeters. You'll see some players that have got a normal size ferrule, so it'll probably be 9.5, and then you'll see that their tip is slightly overhanging. They just prefer that just so they've got a slightly bigger tip and then a little bit more of a visual reference when they're actually addressing the cue ball. Now, actually what tip you put on the end of your cue just comes down to personal preference. So these days, there's lots of different tips available. There's normal leather tips, which is just a normal compressed piece of leather, which is what the old style Elkmaster tips are. And a lot of professionals will still use those. There's also other brands of compressed tips now as well that just play a little bit more consistent. And then there's all kinds of layered tips, which are little pieces of leather that are all glued together, and then they form just a bit more of a solid tip again that's meant to play a bit more consistently, and they don't need bedding in as much. And again, all of these things come down to personal preference. So with all different players in the club, some people will prefer one type of tip, some people prefer another type of tip. So the best advice here is to just try a few, get a feel whether you prefer a bit of a harder tip or a bit of a softer tip, play around and just get a feel for what you personally like. There's no right or wrong. Even between all of the professional players, they'll all use something slightly differently. Some people prefer very old style tips, just a normal Elkmaster. Some people prefer these really expensive new layered tips. So just have a bit of a play around and find out what actually you feel comfortable with when you're playing. So we've talked about the weight and the balance point and the tip size. Another thing to consider is just the thickness of the butt end of the cue at the back here. So most cues are anywhere from 29 millimeters to about 31 millimeters in diameter thickness there at the back. Now, again, this just comes down to personal preference and what you actually prefer when you're holding the cue. My cue is actually a little bit thinner at the back here. It's 28 millimeters in diameter. And that's just because the first cue I ever had, before I had this one made personally for me, was a little bit thinner. So I just got used to the feeling of the cue at the back being that little bit thinner. So when I had this one made, I wanted the thickness of the butt just that little bit thinner. But again, as I say, it just comes down to personal preference and what you like the feel of when you're holding the cue. Now, another thing to consider at the back of the cue here is whether you've got a joint fitted at the bottom of your cue. Now, that's really useful, and you'll see a lot of players these days that have got these joints fitted, because you can screw in then a longer extension when you need to use the rest and you can't reach certain shots. And also you can screw in a little mini butt that players use, and it just means that sometimes if you can't quite reach a shot, you can screw your little mini butt on there and you'll still be able to reach a shot even without getting the rest out then. So that can be quite useful to have that joint. I've got one on the end of my cue and I do use it regularly and find it quite useful. The reason players like it so much is it just allows them to use the normal cue that they're used to. So they've got some of the characteristics of the cue that they're used to, the feel of the cue as they play the shot, and then they can just screw a little extension in the end and they still get some of the feel that they would get using their own cue. And then moving on from these main things now then, what you'll pay for when you're paying for a cue now starts to get down more to aesthetics. So with a cue, you're paying for the quality of the actual shaft that they use. So my cue is an ash cue, so you're paying for the quality of this piece of ash. And then you're also going to start paying for the splices and veneers that you've got at the back of the cue here. So if we look at my cue here, I've got a splice at the back of my cue here with a little veneer over the top, and then I've got the ebony coming up the butt end of the cue here. So what you're paying for here is the fact that I've got these splices in there and that little veneer. Obviously that takes the cue maker more work to put those splices and that veneer in there, so you'll pay extra money for that. And then in terms of aesthetics again, like we talked about, one of the things you'll pay for is the ebony, the tips of the ebony here that you can see on my cue. People like these to be absolutely level as you rotate the cue. So again, that's purely from an aesthetics point of view. People just like that craftsmanship to be very, very accurate and very level at the top of those splices there. Now, as I say, the next thing you'll pay for again is how good the quality of the ashes that they've actually used on the cue here. So most cues are either ash or maple. So my cue's an ash cue. So you'll pay for how straight the grain is on the cue, whether the grain is nice and straight or not. And also there's these chevrons that point down the shaft of the cue. So if you look at the back of my cue here, you can see that on a lot of cues you've got this flat part that's planed off on the back of the cue. And with that pointing up to the ceiling, if you look down the shaft of the cue then, these chevrons point in a perfectly straight line and they point down the line of the shot and the line of the cue. So what a lot of players like is they like those arrows to be perfectly lined up and evenly spaced on the cue, because it's a bit of a sighting aid for players when they're down on the shot. Again, that's completely personal preference. Obviously, if you've got a maple cue, then you don't get this grain on the cue at all, so you don't have those visual aids. So again, that purely just comes down to what the actual player prefers with their own cue. And then again, with the actual shaft of the cue, you'll just have the characteristics of the actual wood. So how flexible that piece of wood is and how much feedback it's giving a player. So some cues are a bit more whippy and a bit more flexible than other ones, and that just affects how shots are played, how the white ball reacts, and also the feedback that it gives the player. So again, that just purely comes down to personal preference, and again, what you personally like the feel of in a cue. So really that's my summary there of things to think about when you're looking for a cue. So we've got how heavy the cue is, where the balance point is, what tip size you would use on the cue, the diameter of the butt end, whether you would have that little joint at the bottom of the cue. But what I really wanted to get across in this video is all of these things really are personal preference. So you want to pick a cue that feels right for you, and don't pick a cue just because somebody else is using a cue with a certain spec and then you try and pick a cue that's exactly the same. So if you can get down to a shop that's near to you where they've possibly got a snooker table and you can actually try some different cues out, so you can play some shots with some different size tips and some differently weighted cues, and just get a feel for what exactly feels comfortable for you and what you personally like. So obviously that's my limited knowledge to do with cues. I'm not a cue maker, so if there is any cue makers watching and they want to leave any comments to give people just some extra things to be thinking about and some of the other things and the craftsmanship that's going into making these cues, then please just leave those in the comments below. So as usual, if you did like this video and you found it useful, then please give the video a like. And if you want to see more videos just like this one, I also do instructional tutorials and practice videos on this channel. So if you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching. Cheers.